Closing the gap. So this phrase I first heard by Adyashanti, and it was actually his teacher, Arvis Justi, that used the phrase. And the phrase talked about the difference, sort of the discordancy between what we know and how we act, how we behave, what we say. That there's a gap in between those two things, and the spiritual journey in some way is to close the gap between the two, so that more and more how we are in the world, how we are within ourselves, becomes more and more congruent with what we actually know. And this is true before and after awakening. Before awakening, we can just notice it in our day-to-day life, and we don't have to talk about big spiritual concepts to get the sense of this discordancy. We know we shouldn't really eat that whole bag of economy-sized potato chips, and yet we do. We know that yoga is good for the body, and yet we may not do it as often as we know that we should. Or on a more subtle level, we may know that in essence, this awareness is impersonal, and yet we may continue to operate from a very personal perspective. In other words, what's in it for me? What's best out of this situation? What do I stand to gain? What do I stand to lose? So we may have had a deep, sincere realization, true seeing of our fundamental nature as awareness. And as strange as it sounds, we may continue to operate most of the time, not all the time, but often from a perspective of, it's still me as a separate self, and occasionally I will have the good grace to fall into this awareness. Even after we recognize that the awareness is fundamental and always present, this sense of it in this body can feel like, but most of the time I'm here living this sort of separate personal life, even though I've recognized this much more expansive state of spacious awareness. So it's sort of an odd place, and it doesn't get resolved right away. The recognition of our essential nature might happen in a moment, right? A moment of sudden insight. That's all it takes. Right? Oh my gosh, that which I've been looking for maybe for decades is what I've always been. Was never absent. I was just looking in the wrong direction. It was here all along, and I was looking for it there. I just mistook myself for being a separate self, but I can suddenly see that there is this awareness that is very intimate and yet not personal. So we can have that sudden insight full on. If we see it completely, right? We might mistake what it is. We might lose sight of it 5 minutes later or 5 days later. But that seeing can be, when it happens, it is complete in a sense. We see what, in a flash, what we essentially are. Immensely liberating. Even to know that, even to have known it and lost the sense of it, is still there's still a residual there that I've seen the fundamental nature of my existence. And the mistake that we make is, how do I get it back? I've lost it, and how do I get it back? So the presumption that it somehow disappeared, right? It was here for a moment, and then it's now gone. And how do I get it back? So again, we're back in that mode of looking for it outside of ourselves. It was here. That was nice, but now it's gone, and I have to go back to looking for it. And we may continue to miss it for some time until, maybe we stop seeking quite so hard, and then, oh, there it is again. And then that path back to that awareness becomes more well-trodden, and we're able to find our way home much more easily and much more frequently. And then there comes a point when we recognize that it's not actually absent. But even then, there can still be that recognition, which is quite clear, and this body-mind not being completely on board with that. I mean, maybe some of the conditioning gets blown away in the moment of awakening. That happens. But I don't know of any case where it was blown away entirely. There's always some residual conditioning, maybe a lot of it, maybe a little of it, but there's always some residual conditioning that needs to be looked at. So there can still be this sense of the awakeness is, I've seen that, and there still can be a sense of, but there still feels like a separate me over here that occasionally is able to access that awakeness. So that's the gap we're talking about. Sometimes it's called embodiment, right? Embodying what we know. It's almost like we can recognize the awakeness, but these body minds are, material objects. So there's a greater density than awareness. And so it just takes a little longer for what we know to penetrate, for these body minds to get the memo of what we've actually recognized. So that's just the way it is. So in Zen, they have a long-standing argument. They have, two, prominent schools of Zen. One insists that awakening is sudden, and the other one insists that it's gradual. And it's really what we're talking about here, right? The insight can be sudden, and the embodiment can be gradual. It takes a while. It's not going to happen overnight. And by not overnight, I mean it can be, I see it sort of as an erosional process over a period of time. I would say probably a decade is about right. Maybe even, 10 to 15 years, to really settle into what has been seen and to see the implications of it. And that can sound discouraging, but in the meantime, you know that everything is okay. It's just that this sort of the seeing it from the perspective of this body mind just takes a little longer, And what that is seeing through the conditioned beliefs primarily. So when we first have a glimpse of our awake nature, and then come back to this sense of separate personal self, the natural tendency is, well, what can I do so I can have that all the time, right? And so we're sort of, in a sense, this is sort of ego grasping after what I want. I want to have that experience, and I want to have it consistently, preferably all the time. And so this is a grasping, it's the ego trying to improve how it feels, right? I had a glimpse, I want more. So this is the ego coming back in and just wanting something better. And this movement actually gets in the way. We think it's like, I'm just determined to, you know, be more fully in that space. But it's actually the ego trying to grasp onto something that's already present. So it's actually the grasping that pushes it away and makes it feel more distant. But what we can do, so what I'm saying is that's counterproductive. Natural, but counterproductive. But what we can do is look at the ways that unawakeness creeps in, which is basically believing some story, right? Often about ourselves or about the other person. So what we can do that is productive is to feel when we've feel that contraction into a separate self. You can feel it in the body, often in the belly, pulling away. And when we feel that, it's an opportunity, actually. What many people do is say, well, that's not right. I'm a spiritual person. Maybe I've had a glimpse and I shouldn't feel that way. Right? But I would suggest just the opposite, that to see ways that we get caught in our personal selfhood, all that sticky conditioning, when those arise, those are opportunities to really look at that. I know it's not as much fun, but that's actually the path, because it's something that we can actually do. We can trust that awakeness is there and will always be there and couldn't be otherwise. We can learn to trust that, but we can still get hooked by our dysfunctional conditioning. So what we can do with that kind of sticky, petty, self-blaming, arrogant, prideful, self-defamation, whatever our tendency is, we can see that if we're willing to see that conditioning in ourselves without going the next step to blame ourselves for it or to condemn ourselves or to feel shame or whatever our tendency might be, without going to that next step, just staying with the raw feeling of it, not running away and not judging it. It sounds like we're not doing anything, but what we're actually doing is allowing our innate awareness to be present for something that isn't in harmony with that awareness. And the miracle is that awareness has a curative effect. I have no idea how it works. All I know is that it does. To just be present. We feel like we have to do something, that if we're just sort of present for it, nothing will change. But I'd suggest just the opposite. When we're willing to be present for it, not run away from it, not judge it, not make any conclusions about what our identity is, but just to be with it, things change. That's what we can do when those periods of sort of unawakeness arise. That's our opportunity to look at it. It's, in a sense, it's life saying, well, how about now? How can you see your awakeness in this moment, or maybe not? If it's the answer is, well, maybe not, then that's an opportunity to look. So Nisargadatta once talked about something that stunned me when I first read it, just the directness of it. And he talked about our willingness to perpetuate our own suffering. In other words, we always have a choice. When some dysfunctional conditioning arises, we have a choice. We can either pay attention, be with it, notice it, sense into it without judgment, or we can live with it the rest of our life and suffer because of it. And it's only our willingness to perpetuate our own suffering that causes it to perpetuate, right? But if we are willing and have enough integrity and self-honesty to really be willing to look at that without saying, well, that shouldn't be happening. I've come too far. I shouldn't be feeling this way. I shouldn't be angry. I shouldn't be depressed. I shouldn't be judgmental. It's happening. It's happening, and we can just be with that. And that's really the path to letting those tendencies subside. And this is something we don't have to wait till after awakening to, remain present for, when something uncomfortable arises. It's actually the discomfort that causes us to bring attention to it, right? So just because there's a discomfort there doesn't mean that we're on the wrong track. But again, by discomfort, I don't mean self-defamation. I don't mean guilt. I don't mean shame, right? That's another layer of judgment that we add on top of the actual experience. So even before awakening, we can notice when we feel off, right? And we can be willing to look at that. Just see where it arises from, see what stories we're telling ourselves, see if those stories are true. They may have some truth to it, but are they really true with what we know deeply? Of course, when we do that before we recognize our true nature, it is more difficult. It can feel a little bit like doing, performing your own appendectomy on yourself. It feels like, sort of carving away your own, what you take yourself to be. And so it's difficult. After we recognize what we truly are, it is easier. That same process is easier because it doesn't feel so personal. And we can look back at our conditioned body, mind, and see, yeah, that's how it got conditioned, right? Through no particular choice of my own. It just happened along the way. And so when we look at that, let's say, dysfunctional behavior, it just doesn't feel so personal because we know that essentially it isn't what I am. Once we recognize our, let's say, original nature as this capacity of being present for whatever's happening. Yeah. Okay, so that's sort of the process is more and more we can access that awareness more and more. The identity may still be parked in the separate self. And I see that as an erosional process, that we know that this awareness is more fundamental, but it feels like, no, it's me still here. Right? I remember even after the awakeness became stabilized, I would still go home at night and drink some wine, and just as a way to sort of compensate this body for pushing it too hard during the day, sort of, personal bodily gratification of some kind. And that went on for maybe a year or two after the awakeness stabilized. And it seemed a little, it was incongruent with what I knew. And then one night I was having dinner with a friend, and they said, I went to order a bottle of wine. They said, well, do you really need that? And it was in that moment that I recognized that that whole tendency was out of a desire to change the circumstances externally, you could say, in order to benefit in what I took it to be as a benefit to this body. In other words, to improve my experience. Right? And in that same moment, I recognized that I was actually okay to remain present for whatever circumstance arose. No, that was the end of it. It was 17 years ago. So, but I'll give one other example. There was also a time, again in this same period, when there was a sense of, yes, this awakeness is present, and I'd still like to improve things for my benefit, right? Still trying to manage, still having sort of an energetic position in how things would turn up. And which was basically, a greedy tendency, right? It's like been given everything and wanting more. So this is the ego. This is the ego just, again, trying to maximize its pleasure, maximize its experience. So we can, these things aren't easy to see in oneself, but that is the journey, right? Is to see these tendencies and see that they're not really in alignment with what we deeply know to be sure. And the more we go down that road, and again, it's, I see it as a period of, quite a few years, with, the intensity and the frequency tend to diminish over time, but there's no apparent end to it because we're talking about these material forms, right? And where that leads to is this spaciousness that we essentially are experiencing the world, this body, everything, right? And so it's in essence, it's one beingness experiencing itself through the perspective of this particular body mind. And we all do that. We may recognize that's what's happening, or we may not, but that's what's already happening. That its existence, recognizing itself as the perpetual unfolding of existence of itself beautifully. And it's not a personal, there's not a personal entity there. We have to convince ourselves of that. It's, again, counterproductive to take anybody's word for it. But what we can do is just look for ourselves often, not look through the eyes of philosophy and what so-and-so said, but really open to the question, I wonder if that could actually be true. That there's not an individual entity here. There's a function, clearly. There's life happening, no doubt. It's just not personal.